This week, work continues on the mizzen mast as Alix does his first graving pieces on his own. And Steve and Carolyn will get the first 2 bilge stringers riveted into Arabella.
So we're really happy with how the cleanup of Victoria's mast is going so far. There were only 2 little spots that we wanted to address, and that is these 2 little rot spots that we had. So I went through and carved these out. We're gonna put in some graving pieces in here. So this one was a little bit bigger than this one over here and went a little bit deeper, but there's, as you can see, nothing left in here. This one, there's still a little bit of dark stuff on the outside here, but this is just a resin pocket, and over here, this is just superficial and isn't gonna get sanded out anyways. So I went through to cut these out. I just marked it out on here, and I had a board on top to make sure that I had a level surface to reference off of. So I used rulers and depth gauges to basically figure out where I was in there and make sure that everything was in one plane, which will make it much easier to make the cookie that's gonna fit in there. I used chisels to chisel it out, and the chisels are a little too fat to get in the corners, so a trick is to use a razor blade. You can kind of start digging those out a little bit. They don't need to be terribly pretty, it just needs to be covered up and take out all the rot spot and have that cookie fit in there well. So at this point, I need to cut out some cookies, and we had a really good idea. There's a little bit of the mast up on the top end that is not going to get used whatsoever. And so if we can get those out of that, that will be the perfect material to fit in here because it will behave exactly the same as all the wood around it. So let's look and see at how I tackled that. All right, so here's the end of the mast. And the top of the mast ends right around here. So we have this whole section that we can play with. And so what I looked at is what the diameter is spec'd for on the plans at the top of the mast, which is this little inner circle here. And then this is twice as big as what it technically should be. And so that let me figure out what I could cut out for cookies on the side. And so I flattened the end of this as best I could and just ran the skill saw across here and finished it with a hand saw and then just cut it over here. And this is still going to leave us plenty of room to work with the diameter that we need at the top over here. And it's even, this part all over here is not even going to be used for the top of the mast. The only thing I need to be sure of is that I can still run the router over here to make the kerfs so that I can taper from the top of the mast over there to the rest of the mast over here, because it's going to taper for about the next 10 feet over here. And that should be perfectly fine. This is all 6 inches in diameter, just like the rest of the mast. So I'm gonna run some kerfs down through here to finish the taper. And we're gonna do that a little bit later. And this should not inhibit any of that. So at this point, I've got 2 weirdly shaped cookies that I need to figure out how to make into those graving pieces. both of the graving pieces are glued in. They look good. Surprisingly, this is my first time really doing graving pieces, so there was a lot to figure out. But I think they came out pretty well. This big one, not as good as the smaller one. There's a little bit bigger gaps on the side. It was a little harder to judge the angle coming in, but they're in there real good. And thank you to Jamestown Distributors. I glued those in with their Thixo Flex Epoxy, and that should be perfect. The other thing is these don't need to look perfect because above the spars we're likely going to paint the mast, so you'll never ever even see these again.
While Carolyn worked on cutting out the hook scarves for the bilge bands, Steve continued work on making panels for the bulkheads.
One of the big questions we had, or folks had, when we initially put out the video of these panels is why do the cedar at a 45 to the oak instead of at a 90? So traditionally plywood is done at a 90. And the answer for that is that when you make commercial plywood, it is much thinner laminations and it is many more laminations. So you have a really high glue to timber ratio, and by having all of these really thin layers stacked all 90 to each other, it ends up being really strong and really rigid. Now, and also very stable. Now the issue with these is they are much thicker than the laminations that you would normally have in plywood. And our thickness planer doesn't go down that thin. We'd have to run it through the drum sander a million times. And it's just not really worth taking it down to true veneers for plywood in our instance. So by doing them at the 45, we're putting the movement of the cedar to some degree in line with the movement of the oak. So timber won't swell and shrink lengthwise, it swells and shrinks widthwise. So if you think about the panels, the oak goes this way and they want to move this way. And with the cedar going 45, they want to move this way. So although they're not moving totally together, if it gets wet and the inner and outer cores all get wet, they are moving somewhat in the same direction. So that'll help them adhere to each other and not fight each other as much as they go through changes. They might check. That is a possibility. Structurally, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to the panels. If they developed a couple checks, it would be unfortunate. But in my mind, we'll just varnish it and it'll add some character. The other thing, which I think is more likely, is that it's going to go near the water and these are all going to swell. And if they do that, they might buckle and warp a little bit. But there is quite a bit of epoxy in there. These are fairly thin boards. They're going to be all sealed and varnished. And this timber has been kicking around for quite a while already. And the other thing to remember is that this is going to go in the boat and it's going to be attached at the top and at the bottom and on the sides, and then bunks and bookshelves and all sorts of other things are going to get fastened to it and through it. So these are going to end up being braced in a myriad of other ways when they're inside the hull. It's not like they're just going to be these huge expansive panels with nothing reining them in. So I think with all of that hardware on there, it's going to go a long way towards helping keeping them from doing any cupping or bowing. If several years down the road they really do swell up and they really do warp and cup and become untenable, then I guess it'll just be time to redo the interior. And we've been told again and again that we're going to want to redo the interior, and that a lot of people who are cruising are, on their third, fourth, fifth interior, just trying to make that small space work for them and trying different things. If we're still making videos when that happens, we'll show you what we do to fix it. All right, everyone raise your hand if these bolts have been bothering you. These shiny steel bolts. We get comments about them all the time. They're finally disappearing. So if you look behind me, you can see that Carolyn and I got the first bilge stringer mostly in yesterday. So we got to do a little more fastening at the stem and at the stern, but we are going to wait until it is a little later in the day. Riveting is not a particularly quiet endeavor, and it's Saturday morning, so I'm going to let the neighbors have a little peace. So I'm going to work here on the port side, getting ready for the next one while Carolyn works on making up the first bilge stringer for the port side here. And the process is real simple. Just take the impact gun, pop these nuts off, and pound these bolts flush. And by pounding them flush, they're still registering the planks, so the planks can't move up or down. And the bilge bands go in at more of a sweep upwards than the planks do. So it's not like the bilge band follows a plank and we're going to be unfastening a plank. We'll be doing a little bit of a section of one plank and then we'll start climbing up into the others. So all of the planks are plenty well fastened. They're not going anywhere through this process. And then as we take out the bolts on the outside, we take them out all the way one by one, drill through and put the rivet in and fasten the bilge band. And so far that went really, really well with what we've done on the starboard side. And we're hoping for a successful repeat here on the port. Once the first bilge bands are in, we'll just start building up off of those and they'll go easier. Getting these first 40-foot ones tucked into the boat is a little bit of a challenge, but so far it's been going great. Getting some slim pickings out of the oak pile these days. So we've been slowly chewing through it. Today I cut a whole bunch more bilge band stock. We need 15 inches wide of bilge band on either side of the hull. So it equates to quite a bit amount of material. And this is all that we've got left up here for the really dry oak. It's kind of impressive the amount of timber that it goes into making the boat. I mean, if you remember, this was all this gigantic pile of oak, and that is now inside the boathouse and strewn around here on the ground. This is all the stock that I cut up, so it is almost 3 inches thick and they're 3 inches wide. So we'll split these down the middle and plane them down. Some of it won't be usable, vast majority of it will. And when I say some of it won't be usable, what I mean is one half when we resaw it has a defect in it, but the other half should be fine, which is why we didn't use this for framing stock and we didn't use this for planking, because we needed much more thickness and the defects we couldn't get rid of. But since this stuff's getting milled down so much farther, dodging some big defect on one side is pretty easy to do, and we'll get a good board off the other. And whatever we don't use out of this for the bilge stringers, bilge bands, whatever you want to call them, we can use in the interior, because that's not too far off, and it'll be really nice to go grab a 1x3 and make it something smaller than to go grab a 3x6 and make something smaller. So it won't go to waste. Why aren't you working? You're just standing there.
I'm
Tired.
It's
Saturday. Working on the weekend. All right. What have you been working on?
I'm getting the last of the bilge stringer buttocks together. So we were able to get some pieces out of the stock that we had and lay up some scarves to get a full length that we would need. And the process was stencil the scarf on with the stencil that we made, and then take it up to the jigsaw, cut out the rough shape. And then here I've been fitting the two together and getting them to a nice, snug, happy fit that when we throw some ring nails into it, it won't come apart. So this is the last one that I have to work with. We're actually looking at the aftmost and then the second aftmost futtock, if you will, piece of the bilge band. And so here you can see on this upper one, I've cleaned it up pretty well. It's a nice, clean, flat, square edge most of the way around. And this after one is not that, so you can still see the rough cut from the jigsaw. And obviously there's some lines left on the other one. What we found is with our stencil, if we left just a little bit at all the ends, once they were all nice and cleaned up, then just that final little bit of fitting made them to go together really nicely. So just the things that I'm taking a look at as I put them together before I finish up the very last one. Mostly it's like what is holding the scarf apart. And what we're working with here is this rough edge of this piece of wood that actually has a slight angle to it. So I don't really need to worry about the length that I'm getting. Once I cut that off, I'll see what I'm working with. I've got an array of tools here, but the first and most important thing is to understand where we're taking stuff off. Going in blind and just start to make it feel good is never a good way to go. So the tri-square and the pencil to start with. And the first thing I'm doing is just checking to see how actually square my cut was. So I'll take the tri-square, hold up against my reference face, which is the face that I planed, know is flat, have the marks on for the other cut. It's good to keep the same reference face. So I look at my tri-square, and this cut's actually pretty square, but you would be able to see on this end that it's touching here, there's zero light, and then over here there's actually a little bit of light coming through, which means that my cut was angled up to this side. You don't want that. So I'm just gonna go through and I mark where there is no light showing through so that I see the angle of the cut. The next thing I do, because I don't just want it square, I also want it a flat, nice straight taper. So use the other end of the rule to kind of see where light's coming through this way. So I find that I've got a mound here. It's kind of hard to see. And then I've got a mound here, another mound here. And I can see that from the face that's facing me with my original reference line. But when we're working with tolerances so small that you can't really visually see the difference between a 64th and a 32nd, that square just gives you a nice flat plane to work with. And since our stencil is also plywood, we have no guarantee that the line is actually straight. So that's kind of what we start with. Again, this face is really nice to work with. The grain is running this way, so I can go down the face. It's a consistent grain flow, so I don't have to worry about tear out. And I only have a little bit of work to do to square it up. So this one's gonna look really easy. So I can take my smoother plane and just take a few swipes. Hits those high spots I marked out. Working with oak is really nice. You can see this pinker spot. That's where I just took it off with the plane. These whiter spots, they're the original cut. So you can see that the plane knocked down the nice high spots. The low spots, we still haven't touched them. Took all my marks away. Well, I could keep going and just assume that when it's all pink, it's all nice and straight. But I have zero comprehension of that. So I'm gonna go back in for round 2 of the squaringness to make sure that I'm really working with square. And you can tell, still got a lot of light up on that side. But we're starting to look pretty straight. So I'm gonna bring out the other heavy hitter little plane. And this guy, when I dial it in, I can just take off one side. So just taking down that high spot. I'm gonna come in at an angle. So here we've got the 2 pieces. They are all smoothed out on their faces, and now we're just doing a final cut. So we're gonna start with this end, and if that doesn't sneak it in, we'll go back to this end. Back to the vise, just beyond. Just gonna make a nice square cut off the end. See where that gets us. Give that a little sand. Looks pretty good. Let's see what happens. This is Steve's broken bench.
One of the many things I don't have time to fix.
And we are so close. Looks like taking a little bit off of this guy is the next step. That's just a little slice action with the chisel. I could cut this, but I don't want to commit to such a large amount taken off right away. Rather sneak up on it, give it a nice snug fit, which we are fastening these together, so it's not the end of the world if they're a little loosey-goosey. It's good practice. So mostly I'm sanding just to make sure I don't have any proud spots that I didn't see before. Let's take it back over. So the next step is just to put some fasteners in it, mostly to hold it together vertically. It looks pretty good. It is not a piano. It's gonna work really well for a bilge stringer. Did you have two at the same time?
What?
Did you have two at the same time?
To what?
Laikas?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I have in the past, but Akiva's always been by himself.
Okay.
He would love a friend.
Somebody I could torture all day.
He's really good. He plays with my girlfriend's dog.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and Radar's like little and old and cranky, and
Aww.
he was really good with him.
Aww.
You're through.
Great.
Well, what do you think of the riveting process?
The riveting process works out really well. You guys have tuned it up in the last, 20 planks that you've put on.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's not the fastest thing in the world, but
they're not going anywhere, which is nice.
I think even if you ground the heads off the inside, they're not going anywhere.
No, I really don't.
They're in there tight.
No, pulling the messed up ones out with the crowbar takes some force.
Yeah.
So, and with fastening a plank through a frame to the bilge stringer, essentially we're making the I-beam of strength, of like an oak I-beam, and so that whole thing's just not going to flex, which is great.
Yeah, it should go a long way towards keeping our stable and from leaking and from hogging.
I think so. I think you're set.
That's the goal, at least.
Yeah.
All right, dinner and beer.
Dinner and beer.
Next week, Alix will be looking for a good way to get the mizzen mast sanded. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next Friday.
Started, huh?
Gotta give it a try.
We didn't take the building down.
What happens if you just let it go?
It's like hard to control.
Yeah.
I'm gonna tear the building apart over here.
Too much. Too much torque.